Welcome to Face the Nation. I'm Leslie Stahl. Blacks are killing more and more other blacks in South Africa. The violence cost 3,400 lives last year, 8,000 since 1984. Yesterday was marked by an explosion on a bus and threats of right-wing white violence during a black protest march on a prison. Nelson Mandela blames the white government.
In no other country would the government keep ministers who have been responsible, whose departments have been responsible for the death of close to 8,000 people. No democratic government could allow that.
Last week, 14 ANC supporters were massacred during a funeral vigil. A gang of men burst in, and in seconds, the room was littered with bodies.
Really, I don't know how I survived, because they started shooting while I was looking at them.
President de Klerk rejected Mandela's ultimatum that he fire the defense and law and order ministers for not cracking down on the violence. Mandela claims a third force of white extremists is instigating the murders. But Archbishop Desmond Tutu says it's wrong to blame the whites for everything.
We in the black community are going to have to do a very serious act of self-examination. Why are we acting in this way?
De Klerk has pledged that all remaining apartheid laws will be abolished, including racial restrictions on land ownership. President Bush is expected to lift some of the economic sanctions as a reward, sanctions that hurt mainly the blacks. But black leaders want them maintained and threaten a campaign of mass unrest if they're lifted.
You can expect that mass action in this country is going to be the order of the day.
Nelson Mandela was set free after 27 and a half years behind bars only a year ago. It's been a time of triumph and disappointments, not the least of which is his wife's current trial on kidnapping and assault charges. Will the ANC break off negotiations with the government because of the violence? We'll ask Nelson Mandela. And we'll discuss the situation in Iraq with Jim Hoagland of the Washington Post and Mideast analyst Jeffrey Kemp. The bloody process of abolishing apartheid, an issue facing the nation.
From CBS News, Washington, Face the Nation with Leslie Stahl.
On Friday, the African National Congress threatened to walk out of power-sharing talks with the white government unless it takes specific steps to end the violence. President de Klerk rejected those demands. We spoke with Nelson Mandela yesterday by telephone from his home in Soweto and asked if he will now break off those talks.
Oh no, we have made it clear that we are giving him until the 9th of May to respond to our demands. If he does not do so, then there is no question of negotiations.
So at this point, you're refusing to take his verbal rejection as an actual rejection?
Well, if that is the interpretation, then you can take it for granted that nothing follows after the 9th of May. We will not be able to engage in any discussions with the government.
Now, I'm wondering how you can really blame the white government for this violence. Even Bishop Tutu has said that you can't blame everything on apartheid, and you have to put the spotlight back on yourselves and examine your own communities when it comes to this violence.
Archbishop Tutu is entitled to express his views. I do not necessarily agree with him insofar as he attributes this violence solely to faction fighting between black political organizations. We have said that faction fighting is merely one of the elements. There is the third force. There is the use of unacceptable methods by the police which have resulted in heavy casualties. And fourthly, there is the connivance of the government, its failure to use its capacity to put an end to the violence.
Let me change the subject if I can. Because of all the moves Mr. de Klerk has made to promise to end the apartheid laws, there's talk that President Bush is about to end the sanctions in this country. Just a few weeks ago, you threatened that if the United States did lift the sanctions, that there would be mass unrest in your country. Aren't you concerned that you're making those kinds of threats will isolate you and turn the international community against you?
No.
Why not?
The fact that mass action might be intensified is merely a statement of fact. The failure of the government to honor agreements reached with the ANC obliges us to take some action. If persuasion fails, the only other alternative we have is to use the power which we command.
But you know, when you make that kind of threat, it looks almost as though you're threatening us or threatening the Bush administration. Because, of course, we'd be the ones lifting the sanctions.
No, I'm sure President Bush would disagree with you. In the first place, President Bush has continued to consult us about the position of the United States government if and when the South African government has complied with the provisions of the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. And we have had no quarrels about that.
Do you disagree with those who say that Mr. de Klerk should be rewarded in some way for what he's done, which appears to be quite courageous, by lifting some of the sanctions, perhaps not all of them, but lift some of them as a reward and even an incentive for him to go on and continue with what he's pledged to do so far?
I find it difficult that anybody should reward an oppressor and not the victims. The people who need to be rewarded are the victims of apartheid, not
but
a
the
man
sanctions are hurting the victims.
Who applies apartheid.
But Mr. Mandela, the sanctions are hurting the victims of apartheid more than anybody else in your country. You would agree with that, wouldn't you?
No, the blacks in this country know how to express their own views. And we are fighting against apartheid precisely because we have a regime which thinks it can take decisions for us, which claims to know what is best for us and what is not good for us. We totally reject that. President Bush does exchange with us, and he has done so on several occasions. We appreciate that. And but what we don't accept is that people should tell us what is good for us and what is not good for us. We are capable of making that decision ourselves.
But you know, I've seen a Gallup poll of South Africa that says that 82% of the blacks there think that the sanctions are counterproductive and want them lifted. 82% of the blacks in your country want them lifted.
Well, there are few occasions in which the establishment takes note of the wishes of blacks. If the international community took into account the wishes of the blacks, then and the South African government did the same thing, and the mass media, today I would not be sitting in Soweto, I would be sitting in union buildings.
But don't you think that what Mr. de Klerk has done is extraordinary? To us over here, he is actually dismantling apartheid. Do you not agree with that?
Well, there are many opinions on this question. Some think we are now free as a result of the changes which have been announced by Mr. de Klerk. In fact, I still can't vote. And the reforms that he has brought about, some of them are very commendable indeed. And we congratulate him for that. But it is pointless to repeal the Land Act and the Group Areas Act and not to give us the resources to take advantage of the repeal of that legislation. If Mr. de Klerk wants blacks in this country to appreciate the changes that he has made in that regard, then he will give blacks the resources to take advantage of those changes. We should have the capital to be able to buy the land which is now available and to be able to stay in the cities. He has said nothing about that aspect. And secondly, many people have been driven out of their land, and because of the principles on which apartheid is based. And there is no suggestion that that land will be returned to its former owners. And what he has done is merely to bring about changes which maintain the status quo. And that is not the type of thing that we demand.
Now, we have heard that you and President Bush had what's been described as a very angry phone conversation because of a statement you made where you seem to equate the U.S. and Iraq during the Persian Gulf War, suggesting the U.S. was just as bad as Iraq. Tell us what you can about that phone conversation. Was he really mad at you?
Whoever invented that story would be better advised to concentrate on fiction. The conversation between the president and myself was very cordial indeed. And we never raised our tones. We spoke very calmly. But of course, we took different positions on the issues which the president raised.
But do you really think that the United States is as bad as Iraq? Do you really think that?
Well, I am not going to compare the United States with Iraq. But
I thought you
all
did.
that I would like you to understand is that we have known some superpowers who have done to other countries precisely what Iraq has done to Kuwait. We don't approve of that, but we do not approve also of certain superpowers invading the territorial integrity and political independence of other states.
Let's change the subject. I wonder what effect you think, I'm getting back to South Africa again, what effect you think the trial of Mrs. Mandela is going to have on the situation in your country right now, if any effect?
Oh, no, I don't think personally it's going to have any effect on the political situation in the country. I don't see the relevance at all.
It must be a strain for you to see your wife, whom we can tell by watching you together how much you love her, that this must be very difficult for you.
Well, this is not my first experience, nor that of my wife, to undergo harassment. We have been born and brought up under severe persecution of all kinds, physical and psychological. And we take the matter in its stride.
Let me change the subject once more. I was wondering if you could tell us, because you've met with him several times now, what you think of Mr. de Klerk as a man. Do you still think he is a man of integrity, and do you trust him when he says he's going to carry through and repeal these laws? Do you believe him and believe he'll follow through?
we must not exaggerate the integrity of any person, no matter what position he holds. What we must concentrate upon is the policy that he represents. And Mr. de Klerk represents a policy which has brought a lot of suffering on the people of South Africa. Our people are suffering now.
Nelson Mandela. We'll discuss the situation in Iraq when we come back. Joining us to talk about Iraq, Jim Hoagland of the Washington Post and Jeffrey Kemp of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Let me ask you both if you agree with the critics who say that President Bush is standing by, sitting on the sidelines while Iraq massacres the Kurds and other rebels is immoral. Jim Hoagland?
I think it is. The President used moral arguments to persuade the people of the United States and indeed the world community that we should be involved in the Persian Gulf and that we had to confront Saddam Hussein and we had to defeat him. Now he's abandoning those arguments. Now he's abandoning, in fact, a successful policy, and he's reversing that policy for reasons that are very mysterious.
Jeffrey?
The President made two mistakes. First, the war ended too quickly. We should have rounded up and knocked off most of these Republican guards before they escaped. And secondly, he was woefully late in condemning what Iraq was doing to the Kurds and being at the front of the international help brigade. The question, where was George this past week, is going to be asked. I think he was right not to intervene militarily at this point in time. The reason we did so well in the war is because we had a coalition behind us, we agreed on our goals, and we used massive force against all Iraqi targets. If you want to really do that, if you really want to help the Kurds, you've got to do that again right now, and I don't think the country wants to see that happen.
But do you think we can go back in there and defend?
I think the only circumstances under which there would be overwhelming support for the use of force would be if there was clear-cut evidence the Iraqis were using chemicals against the Kurds.
But without asking you about public opinion, do you think for policy reasons we should go back in there?
Not unless we can do the job properly and completely, and I don't think we can. I don't think we have the support.
What do you think we should do now? Do you think we should go back in there militarily and get involved in the internal situation?
Well, I think it's probably too late to fashion a policy that's based only on military actions. The mistake we made was to rub out the line that we had drawn about the combat helicopters the Iraqis were using. We should have stuck with the President's policies, and we should have shot those helicopters down. We didn't. The Iraqis were able to use them against the Kurds and to force the Kurds into a strategic retreat. What we have to do now is to have a policy that draws on our military strength, but emphasizes the political aspects of what we can do. That is, Jim Baker on his trip to the Middle East should meet with Masoud Barzani, the head of the Kurds. He should meet with Abdelaziz Hakim, the head of the Shiites. These are people who are fighting against Saddam. We should encourage them to the extent that we recognize their political existence, that they have a political cause, and that the Iraqi government should now move to give them a role rather than massacre them.
But it seems to me that that's exactly what George Bush doesn't want to do if, as I think, he's listening to our moderate allies over there. They don't, which are the Saudis and the Turks and the Russians. They don't want us giving strength to the Shiite fundamentalists or to the Kurds. They don't want them to have separate power centers. Isn't that right?
Well, this is one of the problems with this sort of limited incremental intervention. You go in and you take out the helicopters, but then what do you do about the artillery? What do you do about the tanks? What do you do about the missiles he's still firing? What do you do about the rockets? Sooner or later you find yourself getting deeper and deeper involved into a mess, and if we can do it, why can't the Iranians do it to help their Shiites? That, I think, is the dilemma Baker's going to face, and he's going to be told that by every leader he talks to.
But what about this other question, Jim, about the U.S. policy, Bush's policy at this point, to preserve Iraq and not set up separate little power enclaves to keep Iraq as a whole, because that's what our allies want us to do, and he's agreeing with them.
Well, that's precisely the point, Leslie. I mean, he's listening not only to the allies, but I fear to the polls that show that the American public doesn't support further involvement. The big mistake we are making is not to use the military presence that we have to enforce diplomatic and political goals. We now have a United Nations resolution that apparently has been accepted by Iraq that calls for the destruction of the weapons of mass destruction. It calls for a whole series of things that we will only be able to enforce if we have a military presence there, only if Saddam Hussein understands that there's a penalty for not complying with this. The mistake we're making, I fear, is that sometime within the past 2 weeks, the President decided we're going to get out of Iraq, we're going to pull our forces out come hell or high water, no matter what Saddam Hussein does, no matter how many Kurds he massacres, and no matter really whether or not we can be sure that he's destroyed all his chemical weapons and Scud missiles.
Well, at first, I don't think that is quite the policy. Furthermore, I think you can pull out large numbers of ground forces from occupied Iraq and still retain a formidable, a truly formidable military presence there in Saudi Arabia and on our aircraft carriers, so that for the foreseeable future, we're going to be able to deal very, very severe blows to Iraq if we want to.
Yeah, but we don't want to. I mean, it's obvious that we don't want to, isn't
That's
it?
exactly right. If we don't do it now, we will never do it. If we don't, in this case where we've got 100,000 troops on the ground, stop a government from killing its own citizens in this way, we will never do it.
Why should we do anything to encourage the Shiites?
Well, we should encourage democracy. We should encourage the people of Iraq, as the President said repeatedly throughout the war, to take matters into their own hands and to have their own government.
But this idea that somehow the Shiites and the Kurds rose up because George Bush asked them to is a little bit disingenuous. They did so because they were convinced Saddam was on the ropes and their moment had come. And, you know, the tragedy is they miscalculated. And the tragedy is there is confusion about what signals and messages we gave to them. What we have to do now is to focus on the humanitarian dimensions of this and persuade the Turks to open up their borders, provide them with assistance.
But we did encourage them.
We did. I think the President's statements encouraged him. I tend to agree with Jeff that you can overemphasize the role of the President, but I think we are now faced with an absolutely absurd situation where we are going to be dropping food and supplies to Kurdish people whom Saddam is then going to massacre, and we will do nothing to save those people who are going to be killed because they accepted U.S. food.
Very quickly, Jeff, is this going to backfire on Bush politically?
I think it's going to backfire on Bush, but I think, quite frankly, it would backfire even more if we got involved in a mountain war trying to protect the Kurds against the Iraqi army.
Thank you. Jeffrey Kemp, Jim Hoagland, thank you. Thank you. We'll be back with a final word. That's our broadcast. Thanks for joining us. See you again next Sunday.
This broadcast was produced by CBS News, which is solely responsible for the selection of today's guests and topics. It originated in Washington, D.C.